The day I walked out of Joyceville Institution, it was February. Of course it was February. 8 years in a federal penitentiary in the universe couldn't even give me a decent day to come home to. The wind off Lake Ontario cut right through the second-hand jacket they'd given me at discharge, and the parking lot was half ice, half slush, and entirely empty. No one was there to pick me up. I hadn't expected anyone to be. My name is Lawrence Aldridge. I am 64 years old. I spent 8 years inside for a fraud I didn't commit. And the person who put me there was my own sister. Let me back up. I built Aldridge Family Bakeries from a single storefront in Kingston, Ontario. My father started it in 1971 with a wood oven, a borrowed recipe for sourdough, and the stubbornness that our whole family carried like a birthmark. When he passed in 2003, he left the business to both of us, to me and to my sister, split 60-40, with me as the majority shareholder and managing director. I was the one who had spent 15 years working every shift, learning every supplier, knowing by name every employee who came through that door. Dad saw that. He acknowledged it in the will. My sister got her 40% and a board seat, and a very generous salary for doing what she was good at, which was marketing and charm and making people feel like the bakery was a warm, beautiful dream they were lucky to be part of. She was good at that. She was always good at that. She was always good at that. By 2013, Aldridge Family Bakeries had 7 locations across eastern Ontario, a wholesale contract with 2 regional grocery chains, and a catering division that handled corporate events from Toronto to Ottawa. We were pulling in just under $4 million a year in revenue. It wasn't Bay Street money, but it was real. It was ours. It was our father's name on every bag of bread. The fraud charges came in March of 2014. CRA irregularities, my accountant said very carefully, like the words themselves were something sharp he was handing me. $60,000 in unreported income funneled through a numbered company my signature was apparently on. I had never heard of that company. I had never signed anything for it. My accountant said that was a serious problem, because the signature looked exactly like mine. My lawyer, who was very good and very expensive, and ultimately not good enough, said he'd never seen paperwork this clean. Every document traced back to me, the numbered company, the shell account, the transfers. Someone had spent a long time building this, he said. Someone who knew exactly how you operate. I didn't understand what he meant. Not yet. My sister visited me at the Kingston Frontenac courthouse the day of my arraignment. She hugged me in the hallway and cried and said she couldn't believe this was happening, that she was going to fight for me, that the family was going to get through this. She smelled like the lavender hand cream she'd used since we were teenagers. I held on to that hug. I thought at least I have her. The jury took 3 days to convict, 8 years minus time served on remand. My lawyer filed the appeal and lost. I went to Joyceville a broken man and a convicted fraudster, and I told myself the truth would come out. The truth always comes out. My father used to say that. I held on to it like it was the only piece of furniture in a room that was otherwise on fire. For the first 2 years, my daughter wrote to me. Nora was 31 when I went in, married, living in Hamilton with her husband and my granddaughter Claire, who had just turned 4. Nora's letters were long and careful. She talked about Claire learning to read, about the garden, about small ordinary things, and I understood she was doing it on purpose, giving me something clean to hold on to. Her husband Gordon was polite in the few notes he added. I could feel him managing the situation. Then the letters slowed, quarterly instead of monthly. Then once, from what I can tell, around Christmas 2017, and then nothing. I wrote to Nora a dozen times with no reply. I called the house through the prison phone system, and it rang out. I asked a friend on the outside to check on her. He told me gently that Nora and Gordon had moved. He didn't know where. Nora wasn't talking to me, and I didn't know why. What I did know was that Aldridge Family Bakeries was still running. My sister had taken over full operational control when I was charged. Emergency board resolution, entirely legal. She had been running it for 8 years, and based on what little information reached me through the prison grapevine and the occasional community newspaper that found its way into the common room, she had run it very differently than I had. I hired a paralegal service in my last year inside, using every dollar I had accumulated from prison work and a small inheritance that had been held in a trust the fraud conviction couldn't touch. I asked them to pull what they could on the company's public filings. What they sent me was a picture of a business that had shed 4 of its 7 locations, lost the grocery chain contracts, and been quietly rebranded. The name on the signage now was Maple and Stone Artisan Bakery. My father's name was gone. My father's name was gone. My father's name was gone. I didn't sleep the night I found that out. I lay on my bunk and stared at the ceiling and thought about my father rolling out dough at 4 in the morning because he believed that people deserved something real for breakfast. I thought about his hands. I thought about the way he used to say, "This is not just a business, Lawrence. This is an argument. An argument that good things, made properly, are worth paying for." My sister had renamed his argument, and she had done it while I was in a cell. The bus out of Kingston dropped me at a terminal in downtown Ottawa. I had a phone with a prepaid SIM, a bag with 3 changes of clothes, and an address for a rooming house that a legal aid contact had arranged. I was 63 years old, and I looked, I imagine, exactly like what I was. A man who had been somewhere difficult for a long time and was trying to figure out what the world had become while he was away. I had to find Nora before I did anything else. Whatever had happened between us, whatever she had been told or had come to believe, I needed to see my daughter. It took me 2 weeks and a private investigator based in Hamilton, a former OPP officer named Trevor Park, to locate her. She and Gordon had separated 2 years earlier. She was living in a semi-detached on the mountain with Claire, who was now 12, and working as an office manager for a physiotherapy clinic. Trevor gave me the address on a Tuesday afternoon, in a Tim Hortons off the Queensway. I sat there for a long time after he left, turning the paper over in my hands, trying to figure out what I was going to say. I drove to Hamilton on a Thursday. I parked on her street and sat in the car for 40 minutes. Then I walked to her door and knocked. Nora opened it, and I watched her face go through 6 different things in about 2 seconds. Shock. Fear. Something that looked like grief. Then, underneath all of it, something she was trying to keep controlled, which was relief. "Dad," she said. Just that, just my name for me, which I hadn't heard in years, and I had to press my hand to the doorframe to stay upright. She let me in. We sat at her kitchen table. She made tea because that is what our family does when we don't know what else to do, and she told me everything. My sister had come to Hamilton 18 months after my conviction. She had sat in the same kitchen, Nora said, and told her that I had been stealing from the business for years. Not just the incident that landed me in court, but a pattern, a habit. She brought documents, printouts, a letter apparently in my handwriting from years before, describing a side arrangement I'd made with a supplier that had cost the company money. She said she hadn't wanted to believe it, but the evidence was there, and she'd had to make a choice about what was real. I didn't want to believe her, Nora said. Her hands were wrapped around her mug. I kept telling myself you wouldn't. But the letter looked like yours, Dad. It looked exactly like yours, Dad. It looked exactly like yours. I asked her where the letter was now. She didn't have it. My sister had taken it back, saying she needed it for the ongoing civil proceedings. Of course she had. What changed? I asked. Why are you letting me in? Nora looked at me for a long moment. Claire, she said. Claire found something. My granddaughter, it turned out, had been doing a school project on family history. She'd gone digging through old photos and documents that Nora had kept in a box in the basement. Things from my father's time, from my childhood, and she had found, tucked into a folder of old business records, a letter from the original numbered company, dated 2012, a year before the fraud was alleged to have begun. The letter was addressed to my sister. It referenced a conversation she'd had with someone about restructuring the company's tax obligations through a private holding vehicle. Claire hadn't known what it meant. She'd shown it to her mother. Nora had known what it meant. I should have believed you, she said. I should have known. I didn't tell her it was all right, because it wasn't. I told her I understood, and that was true. And I told her I was going to fix it. And that was the most important thing either of us could have said. Trevor Park was worth every dollar I paid him. He was methodical and patient in the way that former cops either are or aren't, and he was the kind that was. Over the following 3 weeks, he built me a picture of what my sister had done. The numbered company had been incorporated in 2011, a full year before the transactions that supposedly implicated me. The directing mind on the original incorporation documents was listed as a numbered Ontario corporation, which traced back through 2 layers to an address in Oakville connected to a man named Stuart Vance. Stuart Vance was my sister's former business partner from a failed venture she'd run in the late 90s before she joined the bakery full-time. He had a history of filing articles of incorporation for shelf companies and had twice been investigated, though never charged, by the OSC. More to the point, Stuart Vance had apparently helped my sister do the same thing to someone else once before. A former partner in a small property management company, that woman, whose name was Judith Kramer, had never gone to prison, but she had lost her stake in the business and spent 4 years trying to prove what had happened to her. She had not succeeded, but she had documented everything she could find, and she had sent that documentation on 3 separate occasions to the Ontario Securities Commission. Trevor found Judith Kramer living in Barrie. I called her on a Tuesday evening. She picked up on the second ring. "I wondered if someone like you would ever call," she said. No surprise in her voice, just something old and tired and still, underneath it, sharp as a nail. She had more than I expected. She had emails printed years ago that showed my sister and Stuart Vance discussing the mechanics of the shell company structure in the context of the property management dispute. They had not anticipated anyone printing those emails. They had not thought anyone would keep them for 11 years in a folder under a bed in Barrie. But Judith Kramer was the kind of woman who kept things. I met with Judith in person the following week. We sat in her living room and she spread documents across the coffee table and walked me through each one with the careful precision of a woman who had been preparing for this conversation for more than a decade. When she finished, she looked at me. "What are you going to do?" she asked. "I'm going to make sure she can't do it again," I said, to anyone. Trevor arranged a meeting with a forensic accountant in Ottawa, a woman who had spent 20 years doing fraud investigation for the RCMP before going private. She reviewed everything we had brought her, all of Trevor's documentation, the letter Claire had found, Judith's materials, the corporate filings. She asked questions for 2 hours. Then she sat back and said, very quietly, that what she was looking at was one of the more complete private fraud cases she had seen outside of a courtroom. It still wasn't enough for a criminal charge on its own. What we needed was confirmation from someone inside, someone who had known what was happening. Stuart Vance was not that person. He had lawyered up within 6 hours of Trevor making a single indirect inquiry through a mutual professional contact. My sister, for her part, had apparently sensed something shifting, because she had stopped answering her mobile and had, according to Trevor's contact at the Maple and Stone location in Kingston, taken an unscheduled week away. But there was someone else. My sister's former office manager, a woman who had worked for Aldridge Family Bakeries from 2009 until 2016, had left under circumstances that Trevor noted were unusually quiet for someone with her tenure. She had signed something at departure, almost certainly an NDA, but she had also, Trevor had learned through a professional contact in the HR community, spoken off the record to a labor lawyer in 2017 about things she had witnessed at the company that she described as, in her words, morally indefensible. Her name was Carol. She was living in Brockville. I drove to Brockville on a grey Wednesday in March. I sat across from Carol in her kitchen, and I told her exactly what I was doing and exactly what I had already found. I told her about Judith Kramer. I told her about the letter Claire had found. I told her about the forensic accountant and what she had concluded. And then I told her what 8 years at Joyceville had cost me, not in abstract, but specifically. I told her about the February day I came out to an empty parking lot. I told her about Nora not writing anymore. I told her about missing my granddaughter growing from 4 to 12 years old, Through photographs I was sent sporadically by a legal aid volunteer who knew someone who knew Nora. Carol was quiet for a long time after I finished. "I signed something," she said. "I know. I was afraid of her. I know that too." She looked out her kitchen window. She told me, right before I left, that if I ever said anything, she would find a way to connect me to the original scheme. She said she had documents ready. She said she'd been protecting me out of loyalty, and she'd stop if I made things difficult. I thought about that for a moment. It was, I recognized, exactly the kind of thing my sister would say. It was specific. It was targeted. It was designed to make a person feel like the walls were already closing. "She doesn't have anything on you," I said, "because you didn't do anything. What she has is a threat. And the only thing that makes a threat work is if the person on the other end believes it." I looked at her steadily. "Do you still believe it?" What Carol gave me, over the course of the next 3 weeks and with the involvement of an independent solicitor, who confirmed her NDA had been improperly coerced under Ontario Employment Standards Law, was a sworn statutory declaration detailing what she had witnessed between 2011 and 2016. She described conversations she had overheard, meetings she had been asked to quietly erase from the official calendar. A specific afternoon in early 2014, 2 months before my arrest, when my sister and Stuart Vance had met in the back office for 4 hours, and Carol had been sent to do a supply run she had not been warned about in advance, and that took her past a shredding bin outside the office that had not previously been there. With Carol's declaration, the forensic accountant's analysis, Judith Kramer's documents, and the letter Claire had found, I retained a criminal defense lawyer in Ottawa to pursue an application for conviction review through the federal miscarriage of justice process. It was not fast. It was not simple. But within 7 months of my release, we had enough for the RCMP's commercial crime section to open a formal investigation. I had not spoken to my sister since before my conviction. Not once in 8 years. She had not written, had not called, had not appeared at any hearing or appeal. I had thought about what it would feel like to see her again, so many times that the imagined version of it had worn smooth, like a stone you've handled too long. I saw her in the parking lot of a Service Ontario location in Kingston on a Tuesday morning in November. She was coming out as I was going in. She saw me and stopped walking. She looked older. Of course she did. So did I. She was wearing a good coat, camel wool, the kind she'd always spent money on, and she had the same careful posture she'd had our entire lives, the posture of someone who had decided, very young, that how you carried yourself was a form of argument. I stopped too. For a moment neither of us said anything. "I know what you've been doing," she said. Her voice was steady. She had always been better than me at keeping her voice steady. "Good," I said. "Then you know how it's going to go. You can't prove anything that you think you can prove." I looked at her. "You can't prove anything that you think you can prove." I looked at her. I thought about my father's hands. I thought about the sign that used to say Aldridge Family Bakeries and now said something else. I thought about Nora at that kitchen table and Claire, 12 years old, finding the truth in a box of old documents in a basement because she was doing a school project. "The RCMP disagree with you," I said, "and so does your former office manager, and so does Judith Kramer." Something moved across her face. She knew those names, Judith Kramer especially. "We're family," she said, and I could tell even then that she believed it was still something she could use, that the word family still had power over me the way it once had. "You stopped being my family the day you put my name on a document I never signed," I said. And I walked past her into the building. She was arrested 4 months later. Stuart Vance was arrested the same week. The charges included fraud over $5,000, forgery, obstruction of justice, and counseling a witness to provide false testimony. My own conviction was referred for review by the Federal Minister of Justice, and 14 months after my release, it was overturned on the grounds of a substantial miscarriage of justice. There was no dramatic courtroom moment. There was a letter. I read it at Nora's kitchen table, the same table where she had once sat across from my sister and been shown forged documents and had believed them. Claire was at school. Nora had made tea. I read the letter twice, folded it very carefully and set it down, and Nora reached across and put her hand over mine and didn't say anything. I didn't say anything either. The civil process took another 18 months. By the time it was resolved, I had recovered the majority shareholding in what had been Aldridge family bakeries, along with a settlement that addressed 8 years of wrongful exclusion from the company, and a formal judicial declaration that my original conviction was the result of manufactured evidence. My sister received 4 years, less time for her cooperation with investigators on the Stuart Vance matter. He received 6. It was not, in the arithmetic of pure justice, what 8 years of my life were worth. I made peace with that. Justice rarely runs at the exchange rate we need it to. Nora and I rebuilt slowly. We had a lot of conversations that were hard to have. There were things I needed to hear from her, and things she needed to hear from here, and things she needed to hear from me. And the hearing of them was not clean or neat. It was just ours. It happened over kitchen tables and car rides, and one memorable afternoon at a conservation area east of Hamilton, where we walked for 3 hours and said more things than I'd said to anyone in 8 years, and at the end of it were both exhausted and somehow lighter. Claire was the easiest part of all of it. She was 12 going on 40, and she had already decided, with a certainty that 12-year-olds sometimes find before the world wears it down, that what had happened to me was wrong, and that she was glad it was being fixed. She asked me one evening, while we were washing dishes after dinner, whether I was angry. I thought about it. I was, I said. I think I'm mostly just tired now, and glad to be here. She thought about that for a moment, hands in the soapy water. Grandpa, she said, that's kind of the same thing as winning. I didn't argue with her. The bakery, the original Kingston location, is operating again. We brought the Aldridge name back. It was the first decision I made when the civil matter closed. Before anything else, before new equipment or new suppliers or any of the conversations about what came next. The sign went back up on a Thursday morning in October, and I stood on the sidewalk and looked at it for a long time. It was cold. The maples on the block had gone red, and the light was the particular flat grey of an Ontario autumn that I had missed stupidly, achingly, for 8 years. One of my employees, a young woman who had been hired by my sister and who had stayed on anyway and turned out to be one of the best bread bakers I have ever worked with, came and stood beside me. "It looks right," she said. "It does," I said. "My sister will be out in a few years. Stuart Vance is already appealing his sentence. There are people, I'm sure, who still believe the original version of events, the one my sister told for 8 years to everyone who asked. I've stopped trying to correct them individually. The court record exists. The letter from the Minister of Justice exists. The truth is in writing, and it was written by people whose job it is to determine what the truth is, and that is going to have to be enough. I'm 64 years old. I have a daughter who calls me most evenings, a granddaughter who sends me voice messages about things that happened at school that she considers urgent and that I consider the finest content I have ever received in my life, and a bakery with my father's name on it that opens at 6 in the morning and smells, every single morning, exactly the way it did when I was a boy. If you've been told that the truth doesn't matter, that the person with more money and better lawyers always wins, that some doors, once closed, stay closed, I want to tell you what 8 years taught me. The truth is slow. It is genuinely, maddeningly, sometimes unbearably slow. But it moves. It always moves. You just have to still be standing when it gets there. Claire texted me this morning, a voice message, 40 seconds, about a history presentation she has to give tomorrow and a detail she's not sure about. Something about the date of a particular Supreme Court decision. She wants to know if I know. I don't, as it happens. But I tell her I'll look it up, and I do. And I send it back, and she replies with a single word that apparently means she is pleased. I'm standing in the kitchen of my father's house, which is my house now, holding my phone. The bread for tomorrow's proofing in the oven room. The street outside is quiet. It's been a good day. There will be more. I think about Carol a lot. Not my sister, not Stuart Vance, not any of the lawyers or investigators or the people who had to be convinced, one by one, that what had happened to me was real. I think about Carol sitting in her kitchen in Brockville, hands in her lap, telling me she had been afraid for years. She had known. She had watched it happen and carried that knowledge alone for almost a decade because someone had made her believe that speaking the truth would cost her more than staying quiet. That's what the whole thing cost, really. Not money, not a business, not even 8 years of my life. Though it cost all of those things too. What it cost, most of all, was people's willingness to trust what they knew to be true. My sister understood that. She understood it better than almost anyone I've ever known. She was intelligent in that specific, unsettling way. She knew exactly which lever to pull in each person to make them doubt themselves. She used that intelligence to build something that lasted for years precisely because it was constructed out of other people's uncertainty. I used to wonder in those early years at Joyceville whether being a decent person was actually a disadvantage. The people who had done this to me were not decent. They were calculating and patient and willing to do things that I would not have done. And for a long time that meant they won. That's a hard thing to sit with. And I'm not going to pretend I made peace with it quickly or gracefully. But here's what I came to understand, slowly, over years of having very little to do except think. The same qualities that made my sister effective in the short term made her fragile in the long term. She had built everything on the assumption that people like Carol would stay afraid, that Judith Kramer's documents would stay in a folder in Barry, that a 12-year-old doing a school project would put an old letter back in a box without understanding what it meant. She had been smart enough to construct the scheme, but not wise enough to understand that the truth doesn't need an advocate. It just needs time and someone still paying attention. Claire finding that letter wasn't luck. It was the consequence of a child who had been raised to be curious, to take things seriously, to follow a thread when she found one. Nora had done that. She had raised that girl through years of difficulty and uncertainty, and the girl had handed us the first crack in the wall. There is a version of justice that looks like dramatic confrontation, and there is the version that actually happens, which is quieter and stranger, and depends entirely on ordinary people choosing, at ordinary moments, to do the right thing. Carol chose it. Nora chose it when she let me through her door. Trevor Park chose it every time he followed one more thread instead of closing the file. I am not a particularly wise man. I am a baker's son who learned to run a business and then lost everything and had to build the capacity to survive that loss without letting it turn me into something I didn't want to be. What I know is this. The hardest part of those 8 years was not the conditions or the boredom or even the loneliness. The hardest part was keeping hold of the person I had been before. Staying honest in my own mind about what I knew and what I didn't know. Refusing to let bitterness do the thinking for me. That refusal, quiet and daily and almost entirely invisible to everyone around me, was the only real work I did in there. And it was the work that made everything else possible when I came out. My father used to say that bread teaches you patience because it rises on its own schedule, and there is nothing you can do to hurry it. I spent a long time thinking that was a quaint thing to say about a bakery. I don't think that anymore.